Hello and welcome to our first online lecture for developmental reading. Today's lecture will be about emergent literacy. And as we take a look at this first picture on our screen, this is a picture of my daughter Julia. She's now 10 years old, getting ready to turn 11, but in this picture, she's actually about 3 years old. Think for just a few seconds about anything that strikes you about this picture. If you thought for a moment about the size of the book that Julia is reading, definitely not the kind of book that a 3-year-old should be reading. Also, she's wearing glasses. She doesn't wear glasses normally. Our neighbor actually found these glasses in the bottom of his bag and gave them to Julia, and she thought that it would be cool to put them on. But if you can imagine for just a second, it's actually Sunday morning in my house. And in my house on Sunday morning, we cook a big breakfast. And so here's a plate of eggs in front of Julia. We have a big breakfast. We sit at the dining room table. My husband and I read the newspaper, and we both wear glasses. And so Julia is actually modeling what it is that we do on Sunday morning. We're reading the paper. She's reading a book. We put on our glasses. She puts on her glasses. And so really sort of stresses the importance of that idea of family literacy, especially at a very young age, where kids are going to model whatever it is that they see happening in their house. Emergent literacy is a phrase that was first used by Marie Clay in 1966, and it assumes that a child acquires some knowledge about language, reading, and writing before they come to school, and kids do. We don't even need to assume this. And those of you that have kids can totally understand that your kids do acquire some knowledge about language and the way that words work. For example, my daughter, when she was very, very young, would see the golden arches. And we know what those golden arches mean. McDonald's, you can almost smell the French fries from 5 miles away, right? And she would see those golden arches and say, "Oh, Mom, can we stop and get some chicken nuggets, or can we get some French fries?" Okay? And the same with Dunkin' Donuts. My daughter would see that sign from a mile away and ask if we can stop and get some munchkins. So they recognize these very familiar pictures or billboards and make that association with something that they really enjoy. Emergent literacy acknowledges a child's scribble marks on a page as rudimentary writing, even if not one letter is discernible. And so here is Julia's notebook, and this was in January of 2006, so Julia's about 3 years old here, and she's just scribbling on the page, and I ask her what she's doing, and she's writing a letter to her grandfather, okay? But what's interesting is that her writing is going from left to right, and this is one of those things that happens on that concepts about print assessment that we're going to talk about. Can a child recognize that print moves from left to right? And here Julia's already recognizing that at 3 years old. When a child narrates familiar storybooks while looking at the pictures in print and give the impression of reading, we acknowledge that activity as legitimate literacy behavior, even though it cannot be called reading in the conventional sense. And so I keep meaning to insert a picture of a Henry and Mudge book here. My daughter, when she was very young, loved Henry and Mudge. And those of you that aren't familiar with those stories, Henry and Mudge is about a boy and a dog. Henry is the boy, and his dog Mudge is this big, gigantic St. Bernard dog. And they go on all these adventures. And Cynthia Rylant is the author of this series of this book, and brilliantly written. They're written in chapter form, but the words are very large and pretty predictable stories. But my daughter loved those books, so much so that we must have read all of those books about 1 billion times each. And so my daughter would say, "Oh, Mom, tonight I'm going to read. I'm going to read the book." And even though she's not really reading the words in that conventional sense, she's using the pictures to help her retell the story, which has been told so many times that she could retell it herself. And so we recognize that it's as reading in a non-conventional sense. And so here is a picture that Julia drew, and writing via drawing. And as a child is emerging into literacy, the child will use drawing to stand for writing. The child sees drawing or writing as some sort of communication for a specific purposeful message. And so this is a picture of me. I know it looks just like me. And I'm wearing my glasses, and my hair is in a scrunchie, and I'm sitting on the blue rug. I'm missing some appendages, and hopefully those will come at a later time. But Julia loves to tell me what it is that she's doing. So we recognize this whole idea of drawing as writing. Drawing via writing again. This is a picture of me eating a sandwich. I know it looks just like me, and clearly I need a dentist. When Julia's telling me about this picture, she wanted to draw trees because her picture was about our picnic that we were having outside. Writing via scribbling. The child scribbles but is intended as writing, and Julia's all over the page. But then, like I showed you before, she begins to learn from left to right. Finally, Julia makes some letters, and here's her letters right here. Oops. Okay. She makes the letter L and the letter U, and I said to her, Julia, you made some letters, and she says, what does it spell? And I say, well, it spells Lou, which was one of our favorite characters in a movie that we were totally engrossed in called The Trumpet of the Swans. And so at 3 years old, she starts to know that letters make words. And from there, she only wants to know how to write letters. And she asks me, how do I spell this? How do I spell that? She pulls out all her favorite books out of her bookcase, and she copies the titles of all of her favorite books. She's trying to write the word dog in this journal entry, and she gets very, very frustrated. But once she gets it, she feels very proud of herself that she did. And the title of this book was The Night I Followed the Dog, one of our favorite books that we liked to read when she was little. She writes down the titles of her favorite book, and then when I tell her that we can write a letter to Cynthia Rylant, her favorite author, she writes her a letter, and I write in the top, Dear Cynthia Rylant, and Julia writes, I love your books, love Julia. And Cynthia Rylant is awesome and has unbelievable people working for her, and she wrote a letter back to us. And if you can imagine, this is like a postcard that she sort of sends out to all of the people that write to her, and this was a copy. This part of the letter was a copy, but she actually wrote up on the top, Hello, Julia, I really loved your fine letter. Julia writes the word the, T-H-E, and after this, she recognizes the word in everything that we read. And she says to me when we read our books at night, Mom, when we come to the word the, I'll read that word. So that whole idea of that reading and writing connection. Kids always learn to write before they learn to read. She writes Henry and Mudge. She starts to practice her letters and then quickly gets bored with doing that. She likes going back and writing things that she wants to write. And so she writes the blue sky. She wanted to write the word sky, so I spelled it while she wrote the letters. I then prompted to ask her what the color of the sky was, and she says it's blue, and then so I tell her how to write the word blue. She writes eggs, and our dog's name is Bailey. And so she's got this purpose for writing. She wants to learn to write all of her favorite words. Our friend Bill Farr and Julia became pen pals. And so she writes, Dear Mr. Farr, thank you for reading my notebook. She writes a letter to Santa asking for a pair of ice skates. Dear Santa, how are you? I've been a good girl. Could you please bring me a pair of ice skates? She makes a list on Christmas Eve of things that we have to do before Santa arrives. She writes a letter to our friend Claudie, who likes to knit her sweaters. And then she starts to draw our living room, and she attempts to write words herself. Now she's like, Mom, I don't need you to spell words for me. I'm going to try to spell them myself. And she writes, I love my family. And if you think for just a second what that really means in terms of a child emerging into literacy, what letter sounds does Julia recognize? She recognizes that I says I, and in the word love, she hears the L and the V. In my, she hears the sound M, but is confused about the vowel sound E. And then, of course, in family, she recognizes the F sound and the M sound. So she's becoming phonemically aware at 3 years old. It's amazing to me, absolutely amazing to me. As a literacy professor, to watch my child emerge into literacy was just fascinating. So if I'm the teacher and I see something like this, I immediately think to myself, well, Julie is starting to become phonemically aware. She was recognizing certain letter sounds. She needs some help with maybe some vowel sounds, okay? But she gets it. She's starting to get it. I love my family. I love mom and dad, and mom and dad become part of her sight vocabulary. Now, as you read the Tompkins text, I believe that she talks a little bit about this idea of environmental print. And if you go into any kindergarten classroom in the beginning of the school year, you'll see this. The teacher labels everything. The sink has the word sink near it. The cubbies have the word cubby near it. The clock is labeled. The chalkboard is labeled. The whiteboard is labeled. Everything is labeled so that kids can see a picture of an object and then the word right next to it. And so I figured, well, let's try that in our house. And so this is the screen door that is going out to my porch. And we use one pane to write about all the colors that we like. And over here is words that we couldn't quite label. Here's the door. You can see where it says a fly right here. There was actually a fly on the window here, and Julia felt compelled to label it. We start in the bathroom because that's where little kids always start, and bathroom humor never gets old, so we label pee and poop and potty. We label the chair and the table. We label the wall, and then, of course, a picture of Julia and lamp. And so my husband's begging me, please stop labeling things. Let's take all this stuff down. But we did that for a few months, and then it helped Julia to develop her sight word vocabulary. Next, we're going to talk about concepts about print.